So the next 12 slides are lists of antibacterial agents. So these are things we want to highlight about them. So it's kind of like key features of them. So the first one I have is penicillin. So one important thing is penicillin V and G are kind of the original penicillins that they found. Wait a minute, sorry. You can't see what's going on behind the scenes here, but I'm trying to get the highlighter to work. Okay, so the penicillin G and V are the original ones, and they came from this fungus, Penicillium notatum, which is actually from cantaloupe, and it looks all green and fuzzy. So these have to be given IM or IV because they break down if they're digested. So they're effective against streptococci, meningococci, pneumococci, Clostridia, and then aerobic gram-positive rods. So sometimes they're used for urinary tract infections. Okay, now what scientists have done is they've taken penicillin and they've modified it, and that's where we get all the other cillins. Okay, so methicillin, amoxicillin. So all of these have been taken from the original penicillin and modified. Okay, one important thing to remember is the active part of penicillins is this beta-lactam ring, and bacteria have developed this enzyme beta-lactamase that will break it down. So that's how some bacteria are resistant to these things. Okay, now cephalosporins. So when cephalosporins, we're always looking for the cephs. So ceph, and sometimes it's CEF, and sometimes it's CEPH. Okay, so they're very similar to penicillins. They have that same beta-lactam ring, and they come from this other fungus called Cephalosporium. So they inhibit the cell wall just like the penicillins, but they've been modified to become broad spectrum. So here's a list, and some of these guys you've heard of, like Keflex, you've probably heard of, Keflin maybe. So some of them are given orally, some of them have to be given IV or IM because they don't get delivered well through the digestive system. So these aren't necessarily antibiotic choice, but they are wide spectrum. Sometimes people are allergic to them if they're allergic to penicillin. Okay, so here are more that target the cell wall. So these carbapenems, bacitracin, and then vancomycin. So carbapenems, an example is Premaxin. So it's broad spectrum. It's resistant to beta-lactamase, so it doesn't get broken down. Bacitracin, know that it is used topically, so it doesn't get absorbed very well. And it's toxic to the kidneys, so you don't want to give it to somebody. And then vancomycin is used against MRSA and some resistant enterococci. However, one of the problems with it is that it's really toxic. It can damage the olfactory smelling, the vestibulocochlear nerve, and it can cause kidney damage. So if they use it, they're going to do it IV, and they're going to monitor the patient carefully. Okay, but it's narrow spectrum. It works against gram-positive. Okay, now another one that inhibits protein synthesis, okay, so this is going to work differently, is tetracycline. So tetracycline is very wide spectrum. Okay, it gets absorbed through the GI tract. Sometimes you see the cyclines. Okay, so those are what doxycycline you've heard of, like that's used to treat Lyme disease. Minocycline. Okay, so tetracycline, they get absorbed really well. However, because they're very broad, right, they can destroy the normal microflora, and they can cause nausea, diarrhea, liver damage, kidney damage. They interfere with birth control pills. Okay, so you want to be careful if you're on the pill and you start taking these antibiotics. And the other thing is they bind calcium ions. So when they bind calcium ions, you can see it in people's teeth, but it's it's bigger picture than that, but you can see lines, and this is a pretty bad case, but these lines, this is when they took tetracycline, so the calcium didn't get deposited in the teeth. These top teeth have been repaired. Okay, now another one that inhibits protein synthesis is chloramphenicol. So it comes from streptomyces, from these organisms. Okay, so it's synthetic, it's bacteriostatic, it's the last drug if everything else fails. It is good against typhoid fever, brain abscesses, rickettsia, some things that are penicillin does not work on. Okay, but one of the big disadvantages is it can cause aplastic anemia. So 1 in 25,000 people that take it have their bone marrow shut down. So then they can't make any more blood cells. Okay, now another inhibitor of protein synthesis is macrolides. Okay, so these are erythromycin and clindamycin. Okay, so we're looking at these mycins. So they're narrow spectrum. They're effective against mycoplasma pneumonia, which is walking pneumonia, Legionnaire's disease, chlamydia, and organisms that are resistant to penicillin. So aminoglycosides, let me see if I can move this. I probably can't. Nope. Aminoglycosides are things like streptomycin, gentamicin, tobramycin, amikacin. Okay, and they are usually used with another drug, so synergistically. So you'll have one, like penicillin, break the cell wall, and then the other one will inhibit protein synthesis. Okay, so some inhibit nucleic acid synthesis. So examples of those, one is fluoroquinolone, and that's actually Cipro is an example of that. So Cipro. So what it does is it blocks DNA gyrase, so we can't unwind the DNA to replicate it. Cipro is one, it's very broad spectrum, so it becomes the drug of choice. People want to use it because it's very broad. You don't have to know what the organism is that's causing the problem. But they've now found that it has more side effects than they initially thought. Okay, now rifampin or rifampicin, it's a semi-synthetic drug. It blocks transcription of RNA. It's used in the United States against tuberculosis and a meningococcal disease, and it'll interfere with birth control pills too. Okay, now antimetabolites. Those are the ones that are the posers. Okay, so I want you to be familiar with a couple of them. So one of them is sulfa, definitely. Okay, so the sulfinamide. Okay, so sulfa used to be used for everything, but there's a lot of resistance to it now, and people are allergic to it. So they use it against meningitis, or if on here, like it says, if they're going to do colon surgery. Okay, now isoniazid they use, and nitrofuran they use against UTIs, isoniazid, and this ethambutol, I think that's how you say it. Those are used against TB, so tuberculosis. So they're a combination that they give both of those together. Okay, now antifungals. So one thing about fungals, right? Think about fungi. Okay, so fungal cells are like our cells. All right, so they're eukaryote. They're not exactly like our cells, but they're more like our cells than bacterial cells. So some of these antifungals can have side effects, and so it's hard to get rid of fungal infections in a human. Okay, so amphotericin B. Okay, so amphotericin B is used against against fungi, algae, protozoa. Okay, so it's given with IV. Okay, but it has side effects. You feel bad when you take it. Okay, and then three more examples. So nystatin is one. Okay, griseofulvin, which it interferes with mitosis. So this one is pretty strong, so they use it topically. They don't want you to ingest it. Okay, so like a toenail infection. And then diflucan is for yeast infections. Okay, now antivirals. So antivirals, I have some listed on here. So what they're going to do usually, okay, so let's talk about some of them. Okay, so AZT is used against HIV. So what it does is it actually interferes with reverse transcriptase. Okay, acyclovir is also called Zovirax. Okay, and it is given to reduce the symptoms of herpes lesions. It doesn't get rid of the virus, but it helps with outbreaks. And then there are two that are used for flu. So, and now we read like that they're not necessarily sure that like Tamiflu actually really helps, but there's two examples of antivirals. Okay, now antiprotozoans. Okay, so protozoans, hold on. Protozoans are like small unicellular or one-celled organisms that cause disease. So quinine and its derivatives were used to control malaria, but now there's other better drugs. Okay, metronidazole, which is Flagyl. Okay, it works against trichomonas and giardia. So this is a picture of giardia. And then pymethamine, which is now used against malaria. Okay, now antihelminthic drugs. So these are worms. Okay, so I guess the ones that I want you to be familiar with that you might see because of that stuff is ivermectin and piperazine. So they're used against river blindness, so in people, right? So and we'll talk more about river blindness. They're used against heartworm. They're used against roundworms and pinworms. Okay, so they're going to work differently, and usually we don't have worms in people. Sometimes we do, but usually a lot of that is veterinary practice.